Good evening, everyone. Emory Moynagh here for In His Image, and we're going to be talking today about whether Christmas is pagan or not. Whether Christmas is pagan or not. And this is a question that comes up every year just in time for Christmas. We get some people on one side saying Christmas is pagan, some people saying in the middle, well, we don't care if it's pagan or not, we just want to have our fun. And then we've got other people saying, well, no, it's actually not pagan. So who's right? Right? We have groups of people who are arguing back and forth within Christianity and all saying different things. And the atheists are all over saying that, yes, Christmas actually is a pagan holiday, and haha, for you Christians, we've snookered you into celebrating it. So who's right? Who's right in all this? Well, that's what we're going to examine today. And so what I've done is I've gone through and I've looked at Christmas and I've picked out all the major Christmas traditions that I could think of. Every single one. I couldn't fit them all on one slide, but things like the Christmas tree, Santa Claus, the actual narrative of Christmas being born on Christmas Day, snowmen, Christmas cards, the star, the candy canes, the stockings, the holly, poinsettias, the whole nine yards. Everything I could think of that is tied to Christmas, I put in here. All right? So hopefully by the time we're done, we'll be able to sort out pagan from non-pagan, what's good, what's bad, if we should keep any of it, if we should throw the whole thing away. Because if it is pagan, if Christmas is pagan, if it's based on pagan roots, then we really probably shouldn't be celebrating it, right? I mean, we do not redeem things that are evil. You can't redeem evil. So if Christmas is based on a pagan holiday that was incorporated by the church, then it needs to be rejected. That doesn't mean we shouldn't celebrate the birth of Christ, but it does mean we shouldn't celebrate it on December 25th as part of the traditional Christmas celebration with the Christmas tree and, the holly and so on, right? So with that in mind, let's go into this and let's see what we can determine, right? So let's have a look at this. Now, this is a video that's fairly old. It was posted to YouTube in 2013, but it's much older than that. And this particular video is pretty characteristic of what we found on YouTube. It's one of the most popular videos about Christmas being pagan on YouTube. So let's have a listen to what it has to say.
Sun worship played an important part in nearly all the pagan mysteries. The pagans set aside the 25th of December as the birthday of the solar man. They rejoiced, feasted, gathered in processions, and made offerings in the temple. In fact, the merrymaking is rooted in paganism. The Bible never gives an exact date for Jesus' birth. So when the Christian church adopted December 25th, it was superimposing a Christian festival on a previously held pagan one, says Richard Heinberg, author of Celebrate the Solstice.
Alright, so let's go over that real quick. Basically what they're saying here is that the date of Christmas is adopted from pagan festivals and that the church just dropped Christianity on top of a pagan festival and said, here, we're going to celebrate Christmas here. Now, note something there about that video, and this is pretty common, by the way. No ancient source cited saying that. None. No ancient source. Now, this video is much longer, but none of the sources are ancient sources. And that's pretty common. Most of the people who say that Christmas is pagan do not go back and do the historical research. They just uncritically accept whatever they're told in the present. And let's be real here, the atheists have control of just about everything. Right? They control the encyclopedias, the dictionaries, the publishing houses. What they want to be printed is what gets printed, unless it's being printed from a Christian perspective, an openly Christian perspective. Right? Because atheists have passed themselves off to the culture as being neutral. They're not neutral, but they've passed themselves off to the culture as being neutral, like this Richard Heinberg guy, who, by the way, is a massive advocate for climate change, and is someone who is on board with the Greta Thunberg, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, 12 years to save the planet mantra. So he's probably not somebody we should be listening to about Christmas. For one thing, he doesn't have the expertise. For another, his evangelical credentials are slightly expired. I don't think he's a Christian, and yet we as Christians are letting him tell us what we should and shouldn't do. All right, so if you want to make an argument that Christmas should not be celebrated on December 25th, that's perfectly fine, and we're going to talk through some of those arguments here. But we need to be doing it from a perspective of what did the early church practice before the Catholic Church took over? What did the early church practice? What do we know? What do we need to examine in the present? What has pagan roots and what doesn't, based on earliest known writings? All right. So, what do we know about Christ's birth? Well, we know that it's traditionally been dated as December 25th, and conventional knowledge says that it was borrowed from pagan holidays that were meant to celebrate pagan gods. Now, is any of that true? Well, that's part of what we're going to be trying to find out today. All right, so what do we know about Christ's birth date? The date is not in the scriptures. We know this. The Bible does not tell us Christ was born on X day. It would be nice if it did, so we could settle this whole debate right here and right now. But it isn't, right? So, what we do know, though, is that shepherds were in the fields. Now, I've heard people say that shepherds couldn't have been in the fields in December because it's too cold. Well, it might be too cold in Minnesota to have sheep out in the fields, but it's not in Bethlehem. This is the weather for December 25th of this year. Note the temperature. 61 degrees Fahrenheit on Wednesday, December 25th of this year. The low, 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, 40 degrees Fahrenheit is cold if you're used to living, in South Florida, but it's not that cold if you live in Minnesota, right? If you're used to 40 degrees, it's not that bad. All right, so this is not bad weather. In fact, let's have a look at the averages. Here are the averages for Bethlehem. I went to, by the way, easy to double check me on this, weather.com, go to Bethlehem. All right, it's not hard at all. Notice the average temperature for December. 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Average low, 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Is that really too cold for sheep? Well, no. As a matter of fact, they wouldn't be outside in what we would think of as the typical summer months of the year. Why would they not be out there? Look at the rain chart down at the bottom, the average precipitation chart. Note what is not there. From May to October, you get a grand total on average. In those 6 months, you get a grand total of 1 inch of rain. On average. That's not enough to grow grass consistently. You can't take sheep out in the field to eat grass if there's no grass. See, the rainy season starts in late October, early November, and it runs through till about the middle of April, maybe the beginning of May. You get about an average of 4.3 inches of rain in December. Mostly rain. You might get some snow in higher elevations. So, this is the perfect weather to have sheep out in the fields. It is literally the perfect weather for it. December, January, February, and March. Those 4 months, maybe November, you basically have a 4 to 5 month window in there where shepherds would be out in the fields. So if anything, this argument, if you flip it back around, comes back around and says, actually, December 25th would be one of the dates that would be expected. You would have shepherds out in the field. So this argument against December 25th being the birth of Christ it's spurious. It doesn't work. It works great if you only think about your climate as being your own climate. But when you actually look at the climate of Bethlehem, it's much nicer there in the middle of December than it is, say, in Canada or Northern Europe or Alaska. It's much nicer there. It's perfect weather for sheep being outside. So if anything, that strengthens the argument. Okay? So, what else do we know about Christ's birthday? Well, some people have proposed that he was born on a Jewish feast day. Oh, that's possible, except for one tiny detail. It's not mentioned in Matthew. Now, why does that matter? Well, Matthew was the gospel that was written to the Jews. Matthew was the gospel explicitly written to convince a Jewish audience that their Messiah had come and they had rejected him. Matthew doesn't mention it. If Jesus had been born on a feast day, it stands to reason that Matthew would have told the Jews about that. Now, he didn't. He did not mention it. Now, what does that tell us? Well, again, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because he didn't mention it doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it seems logical that he would have. Right? Now, there's also this concept, which is the Jewish integral year concept. Now, what is this? Well, this is the idea that a prophet would die the same day he was conceived, because they understood that life began at conception. So the idea was that a prophet would die on the same day he was conceived, and they knew that it was 9 months till birth. So the early church worked out that Jesus died roughly March 25th, roughly speaking, because that was about the time of Passover, and they knew that he had died as part of the Passover. Right? So they knew that, and so they worked backwards. They said, okay, he died on March 25th. That means he was conceived on March 25th, using this Jewish integral year concept. All right? So that means moving forward 9 months, he had to have been born December 25th. Now, that's not in Scripture anywhere. That is not inspired. But based on the Jewish tradition, it makes sense. Now, whether the Jewish tradition is accurate or not is entirely your mileage may vary, right? We don't know. It's not in the Bible. We have no inspired proof that this is an accurate statement. Okay? But it does lend some credence to the early church putting the date of Jesus' birth on December 25th for non-pagan reasons. Right? For non-pagan reasons. Now, so the date of December 25th, was it actually borrowed from paganism, or was it because the early church believed in this integral years concept? Well, let's have a look. So this gentleman is a Messianic rabbi, a Messianic Jewish rabbi, and he has a message that he talks about whether Christmas is pagan or not. And I'll give this man credit. He's done more work than the average person who believes that Christmas is pagan. So let's have a listen to what this gentleman has to say.
And we also see something similar to this from the Encyclopedia of Biblical, Theological, and Ecclesiastical Literature. Long name, but one of my favorite references. It says, the fathers of the first 3 centuries do not speak of any observance of the Nativity. The Nativity is Yahshua's birth. No corresponding festival was presented by the Old Testament. The day and month of the birth of Christ are nowhere stated in the gospel history and cannot be certainly determined. So this is a very credible reference, by the way. It's the cream of the crop. Credible reference, mainstream reference. This is not some odd reference that most would deny and reject. Most scholars would freely acknowledge this reference. And it says here that the fathers of the first 3 centuries knew nothing about the Nativity, about Yahshua's birth, about this celebration we call Christmas.
All right, so a couple things. First of all, the Messianic Jews do not use the name Jesus. They use the name Yahshua, which is the Hebrew. I don't find any need for that. The apostles use the name Jesus, so I don't see the need for that. But that's they want to believe that. That's fine. But the point I want to make there is he says that the early church fathers knew nothing about the Nativity. Nothing. The first 3 centuries after the birth of Christ, there's no mention of the Nativity. Well, that would be 0 to 100, 100 to 200, and 200 to 300 AD. AD 300, AD 200, AD 100. And unfortunately, his reference, while it may be a mainstream reference, is A, not a scholarly reference, and B, is ignorant. Because, well, let's get into the pagan holidays first. There are 2 common suggestions. He made a fairly strong case to believe that, if he's right. Now, he's not, but we're going to come back to that. All right, there are 2 common suggestions, one being Saturnalia, and the other being Sol Invictus, otherwise known as Unconquered Sun. That's what the name Sol Invictus means. All right, so let's go through Saturnalia first. But before we get there, let's listen to this video. This is probably the single most popular video on YouTube talking about Christmas being a pagan holiday.
Christmas and Easter, though the greatest festivals in the Christian calendar, are celebrated with customs that originated in superstition and heathen rites hundreds of years before Christ was born. Even the dates owe more to pagan practices than to the birth and resurrection of Jesus. It was not until the 4th century that December 25th was fixed arbitrarily as the anniversary of the Nativity, because the pagan festivals from which so many Christian customs spring were held around that time.
Notice where they got this information. Reader's Digest. Folks, Reader's Digest is not a credible source. not to build something on. Right? And by the way, it says not until the 4th century that December 25th was fixed. We are going to disprove that in a minute here, but we're going to talk about Saturnalia and Sol Invictus first. Reader's Digest. I mean, that to me, as someone who is a researcher by trade, that's embarrassing. That we're accepting the claims of Reader's Digest at face value. It's particularly when a very brief internet search would have counteracted this. All right, so let's look at Saturnalia. Saturnalia was a Roman pagan holiday, and it has been resurrected sort of today by a lot of atheist groups who want to split any historicity from Christianity, to say that Christianity is not true by saying none of its historical events happened, and that's what the whole Keep Saturn and Saturnalia poster is. That's from one of the atheist groups. They post these signs up. Freedom from Religion Foundation posts them. I'm fairly certain American Atheists, American Humanists, and so on do so. Basically, what the whole point is to divorce Christianity from its history. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the church don't know enough about church history to understand that's what's going on. So Saturnalia, what do we know about it? Well, it was a very pagan festival. It was a lecherous, lascivious, drunken festival. All right? There was a lot of drinking that went on. There was a lot of perverse sexual acts. There was a lot of licentiousness. It was a very, very pagan festival, but it honored Saturn, otherwise known as Kronos, who was the Greek god of time, among other things, depending on whose mythology you're reading. Interestingly, Saturn was a real person. He was deified. He's actually named in the Bible. His name's Kittim. Now, his name got twisted and spun going throughout history, but he's in the lineage of Noah. He's listed in Genesis 10:4. Right? They've worked back and they figured out that this is who this guy is. He lived for a long time, and so he kind of ended up getting deified. Now, Saturnalia, which is the festival, ran from December 17th to December 23rd. Originated on December 17th and was gradually extended from December 17th onward because the Romans liked celebrating and having their fun so much. Right? So, notice what date is not in there. If you said December 25th, you'd be right. Now, I understand the sentiment here. You know, the early church wanted to incorporate a pagan festival, so we said, well, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna borrow from Saturnalia. Well, you can't really make that argument. And the reason you can't make that argument is because it doesn't include December 25th. Now, if you want to say Saturnalia was the basis, go ahead, but you have no historical proof for that, because it doesn't even overlap. And folks, I'm sorry, if it doesn't overlap, it's really tough to make an argument that the church borrowed from it. Why would the church put a Christian festival that they wanted to attract pagans to right after a pagan festival? It would make sense to try to replace the pagan festival, but not put it 2 days after. You'd think you'd either want to tack it on to the end or try to replace it, but in this case, they do neither. All right, now that leads us to Sol Invictus. And this is Sol Invictus, known as the Unconquered Sun. Sol Invictus was instituted by Emperor Aurelian in AD 274. Remember that date? That date is important. That date is very important, all right? So just keep that date in mind. Emperor Aurelian in AD 274. Now, Aurelian was basically attempting to unite a badly divided empire. The empire had been split. Independent little mini empires had broken off, and he was trying to unite them all behind one god, the sun god, and at the same time make a political statement against the Christians. Right? So Sol Invictus, when he placed his celebration in 274 AD, was placed on December 25th. It was placed on December 25th, which means it does overlap with Christmas. It does overlap with Christmas. However, well, let's have a listen to what Rabbi Randy Folliard has to say before we go any further, actually.
There's no debate here. Everybody understands Emperor Constantine was a sun worshiper, and he was the one who really solidified this transition. It was already occurring, but he's the one that really helped it along. We find how strong this influence was from another reference here. This is the New International Dictionary of the Christian Church. Again, reputable sources, page 223. It goes on, it says this: December 25th was the date of the Roman Pagan festival inaugurated in 274 as the birthday of the unconquered sun, or Sol Invictus, which at the winter solstice begins again to show an increase in light. Sometime before 336, the church in Rome, listen to this, unable to stamp out this pagan festival, which gives me reason to believe that they tried to do something, but evidently whatever they were doing was not enough. It was not sufficient. It says it spiritualized it, repackaged it, as the feast of the nativity of the S-U-N of righteousness. So we see here that in 274 CE, Rome officially commemorated December 25th as the birthday of the sun. This was again Sol Invictus. Now about 60 years later, we see here that the church, unable, says to stamp this out, to remove this influence, the church simply adopted it.
Okay, so the claim there is that it was founded, and he admits, founded in 274 AD on December 20, AD 274 rather, on December 25th, and that the church adopted it in the mid-300s. Well, that's all well and good, except for, a few inconvenient facts. So, does he make fair points? Yes, but he's left out some facts. So let's go into what the facts he's left out. This is a quote from Hippolytus of Rome. Now, Hippolytus of Rome was a deacon, I guess you could say, in the Church of Rome. He was maybe a pastor of a house church in Rome during the early 200s. He wrote a commentary on Daniel, which is what this quote is from. And Hippolytus was by no means a go-along-to-get-along type of guy. Hippolytus was a reformer. Hippolytus was somebody who was very much interested in doing the right thing. He had a very strong argument with the Church of Rome, with the church, the pastor of the main church in Rome, to the point where he was sort of on the outs for a long time. He was not somebody who got along with people just to get along. He was very much an independent thinker. So for him to make this argument here, he's not just cowing to Catholic dogma. Right? So here we go. For the first advent of our Lord in the flesh, when he was born in Bethlehem, 8 days before the calends of January, which is December 25th, the 4th day of the week, Wednesday, while Augustus was in his 42nd year, which is 2 or 3 BC. Now, by the way, these little brackets, they're put in by where this came from, the source where this came from, which is a fragment of, I believe it's Eusebius. But this is put in afterwards to explain some terms that we don't know. So like the calends of January, for example, nobody would know what that meant except in English, except based on a lot of history, we know that that's December 25th, right? But from Adam, 5,500 years. He suffered in the 33rd year, 8 days before the calends of March, April, which is March 25th. The day of preparation, the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, which is roughly 29 or 30 AD, while Rufus and Rebellion and Gaius Caesar for the 4th time, and Gaius Cestius Saturnius were consuls. In other words, Hippolytus gives an incredible amount of historical detail. Right? He clearly knows his history. He knows what was going on. He knows who was involved. He gives years. He gives exact dates. He's well read up on this, and he believed that Jesus was born on December 25th. So clearly, remember, this is in 202, AD 202. This is 72 years before Emperor Aurelian. 72 years. Aurelian wasn't even born when Hippolytus wrote this. And Hippolytus isn't the only one. There's Julius Africanus, circa AD 220. He wrote about the birth of Christ being on December 25th. Right? So Sol Invictus, which was AD 274, that's 54 years after Julius Africanus approximately, and 72 years after Hippolytus of Rome. And in fact, we have no historical evidence that Sol Invictus was even celebrated until AD 354. So, Aurelian proclaimed it in 274, but we have no historical evidence whatsoever that it was celebrated at all until AD 354. Folks, Christmas Day, the December 25th, is not borrowed from Sol Invictus. It can't be. The history doesn't match up. The history just simply does not match up. So what do we know about Christ's birth? There were no pagan holidays involved. None. There were no pagan holidays in picking December 25th. Now, whether December 25th was the day he was born, we don't know. But there were no pagan holidays involved. Therefore, Christmas itself, as we celebrate it today on December 25th, is not a pagan holiday. I'll repeat that for emphasis. Christmas is not a pagan holiday. It was not sanitized by the church. It is the day that the church has traditionally, throughout history, from the earliest time, celebrated the birth of Jesus. That doesn't mean, however, that there aren't aspects of it that could be borrowed from paganism. Right? So let's have a look at some of the other aspects involved with the celebration of Christmas. Right? 1225 is not a pagan date. It never was. It was only put there by Aurelian to try and bring the Christians into the pagan churches, not the other way around. So let's look at Christmas trees. Christmas trees. Now, I know people are already going to that verses in Jeremiah. We're going to get to those in a minute. So what they all say is that trees are pagan idolatry, that they're somehow tied to Saturnalia or something like that. And they'll quote this verse, Jeremiah 10, verses 2 to 8. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven. For the heathen are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, and the work of his hands of the workman with the axe. They deck it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers that it move not. They are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. They must needs be born, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither also is it in them to do good. Forasmuch as there is none like unto thee, O Lord, thou art great, and thy name is great in might. Who would not fear thee, O King of nations? For to thee doth it appertain. Forasmuch as among all the wise men of the nations, and in all their kingdoms, there is none like unto thee. But they are altogether brutish and foolish. The stock is a doctrine of vanities. All right. A lot there to unpack. But do you see similarities to a Christmas tree? Well, only in the fact that they go and cut a tree out of the forest and then put some silver and gold on it. But could it not be that they're making an idol to fall down and worship? Note the verse. They are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. They must needs be borne. That means they must be carried. They have to be taken. They can't go from place to place. This is an idol that is being carried in a procession. And it's telling not to be afraid of them. Now, I don't know anybody who's afraid of a Christmas tree or anybody who's worshiping a Christmas tree. I don't know of anybody who does that. Not even people who are pagan worship the Christmas tree. But this verse continues to be used. And unfortunately, what we have is people who are twisting this verse to make an application. Now, I'm not saying that you have to have a Christmas tree. If you feel that it will be a temptation to worship that tradition too much, then by all means, don't get a Christmas tree. But don't tell me that the Christmas tree itself is pagan. God created no pagan trees. No tree that God created is pagan. That includes evergreen trees. Just because they were used by pagans does not mean they're pagan. And by the way, they're not talking about evergreen trees in this passage, necessarily. There's nothing about evergreen trees in this passage. However, evergreen trees are mentioned in other places in Scripture. But before we get there, let's talk about how we got Christmas trees in Christianity. There's a legend that Martin Luther went out in the forest and saw light streaming from the stars through the branches of an evergreen tree. And he was enchanted. He thought how much that reflected the love of God streaming down toward us. And so he cut cut the tree down and brought it into his family home. Now, whether that's true, false, or otherwise, who knows? However, it entered mainstream with Prince Albert. That would be Queen Victoria's husband. All right? What it did here is that Albert basically, when he married Victoria, brought the custom with him to England. Victoria married Albert and loved Albert very much. A matter of fact, it really broke her when Albert died. It really did a lot of damage to her. She wasn't the same person after that. But because Victoria was the equivalent of a celebrity in the modern world, she was well covered by the American press. And as a matter of fact, this picture here that you're seeing on the screen is a picture that was drawn of the royal family with their Christmas tree. And because us Americans didn't want to seem like savage country bumpkins and looking at the English, we started bringing in Christmas trees too. And the tree kind of represented God's favor. That was the idea it was supposed to represent. And you'll find this in quite a few verses here that it was to represent God's favor and goodness. Evergreen trees represented that, and this is just a sampling. There are more verses. So if you look at it, evergreen trees are not pagan. Bringing one into your house isn't pagan, so long as you're not turning it into an item and worshiping it. At that point, it becomes pagan. Now, if your tradition of putting up a Christmas tree causes you to worship something other than God, then yes, you have a problem that needs to be stopped. But most people don't do that. Let's just be real. Most people don't do that. All right, and also, by the way, evergreen trees are good for a lot of herbal remedies. Evergreen tea, various other different things. Yeah, there's a whole laundry list of things. There's an article on the Essence Genesis website that lays a bunch of these out. Herbal remedies have been used for evergreen trees for years, and they also kind of smell nice, unless you're allergic to them, which my grandfather was. But if they also kind of smell nice. So I could easily see people bringing them into their houses just for that reason alone. Or bring at least maybe evergreen branches into the house because of the smell. Because remember, medieval Europe, people didn't take baths very often. So they stunk. So bringing in something that had a good odor to cover the musk wouldn't have hurt. But they have no pagan roots whatsoever. These evergreen trees, these Christmas trees, have no pagan roots. What about Santa Claus? Let's get into Santa Claus. So Santa Claus is actually based on a real person, believe it or not. And this real person was a Christian. He was Nicholas, the Bishop of Myra. He was concurrent, by the way, with the Council of Nicaea. He was actually, according to legend, he was at the Council of Nicaea. And I'm not sure if I believe this legend. But the legend goes that at the Council of Nicaea, the heretic Arius got up and started to say that Jesus was not actually God. And it so angered Nicholas that he got up and slapped Arian in the face. Arius, rather. I keep saying Arian. It's Arius. It was the Arian heresy. Which, by the way, has made it back into the church these days through Mormonism and a lot of evangelicals believing that Jesus wasn't actually God, but I digress. So Nicholas basically comes out and says, Nicholas is the person this legend is based on. Now, why is it based on Nicholas? Well, because Nicholas, we're going to come to that in just a second. Back up. Nicholas was known for being incredibly generous. Incredibly generous. He was known to give gifts to children. There's a legend that he gave gifts to a poor families for their 3 daughters' dowries by leaving them in stockings, which is the origin of the stockings myth that goes along with Christmas right there. It's based on St. Nicholas, the Bishop of Myra. Right? That's what it's based on. All right, now the word Santa Claus is a corruption of the Dutch way to say St. Nicholas, which is Sinterklaas. Sinterklaas. Well, that's St. Nicholas in Dutch. And that came into English as Santa Claus. It's pretty obvious, isn't it, if you look at it? Most of the myths that we know today resulted from the early 1900s poem, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." Called Santa a jolly old elf, put him at the North Pole, reindeer. Basically, the entire modern Christmas myth of Santa Claus comes from "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." Up until that point, Santa Claus had basically been a normal human who gave some gifts to kids, maybe. Most of the stuff we know about Santa Claus today comes from this poem. All right. The gifts, by the way, did not come from Nicholas. That tradition started with the Magi. Nicholas was just following in that tradition. The Magi, of course, gave gifts to children: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Right? Gave gifts to the child Christ. All right. And by the way, again, source of the stockings myth, the stocking part of Christmas. Nicholas was the source for that. Now, again, whether all this stuff is true about Nicholas, we don't know. There's reason to believe he wasn't at the Council of Nicaea. So that's possibly not true. But it still makes for a great story, and which is why it was told. Right? So, let's move on to candy canes. Let's look at candy canes. So what do we know about candy canes? Well, we don't really know very much about the origin of candy canes. We don't really know much at all. It's believed that they possibly came from Germany, maybe Cologne. The myth is that a local choir master, in order to keep his younger students behaving, basically gave them sugar sticks that were, and when the local church board complained that, maybe we shouldn't be bribing students in order to, get them to behave, he beat the candy strips into a J shape so that it looked like, a shepherd's staff shape, so that it looked like, a shepherd's staff, so it had some theological significance, right? Now, it became popular in Europe at nativity plays. In the Catholic and Lutheran and so on churches, they became popular to hand out as part of a Christmas celebration, which is how they kind of got attached to Christmas. And they appeared in Massachusetts in America as early as 1837, where they started being handed out and given. Originally, they did not have red stripes. Those came later. Around 1920 or so, they became popular in the mainstream, and this is about the time they acquired their red stripes. And this is also about the time you started having the Christianized myth that grew up around them, which is that the J stands for Jesus, the upside down part for the shepherd's staff, red is for the blood, white is for purity, and so on. You go through. There's a popular Christmas children's book that goes through the myth of the candy cane. It's not true. None of that's true. It makes for a great story. It makes for a great allegory that you can use to teach children with, but it's not true. The candy canes are only associated with Christmas because of their ties to European nativity plays. Again, not something that is necessarily good or bad. It's just how you use it in this particular instance. So what about snowmen? Well, there's some interesting stuff about snowmen. The first one that's noted is from 1380 in what's called the Book of Hours. Now, the Book of Hours is a highly anti-Semitic document, which basically blames the Jews for the plague in Europe. The first picture of a snowman is a snowman sitting on a chair, facing a fire, melting away, wearing a Jewish cap. So, yeah, and then a passage talking about the resurrection of Christ. So, yeah, they're highly anti-Semitic in their origin. So, if you take that into account, then maybe we shouldn't be building snowmen. As I said, used to blame the Jews for the plague. Again, not a ton here on the origin of snowmen. It's kind of speculated that wherever there was enough snow to build them, that people would build them. Perhaps they were used as idols or representations of idols in the north. We don't know. There's no real good evidence on this. Somebody actually wrote a book on the origin of snowmen and was able to trace it all the way back to 1380, but that's as far back as they could go. Now, what about Christmas cards? We send those out every year, or most of us do. What about Christmas cards? Well, they originated in Germany in 1611. Ironically enough, the same year the King James Bible was first translated into English. They originated from Germany, and they were sent to James I of England and his son from a German, basically a German scientist, sent a Christmas greeting to James I and his son. Now, here's what that greeting said. Quote, "A greeting on the birthday of the sacred king to the most worshipful and energetic lord and most eminent James, King of Great Britain and Ireland, and defender of the true faith, with a gesture of joyful celebration of the birthday of the Lord. In most joy and fortune we enter into the new auspicious year 1612. It's a very Christian statement, isn't it? I mean, it's Old English, but it's a very Christian statement. He acknowledges Christ twice. He acknowledges this is the birthday of Christ. All right, so all of this is very highly Christian. That was the first Christmas card. Now, they were first commercialized, though, in 1843. by Sir Henry Cole and J.C. Horsley, who was a friend of his. Basically, Cole was a member of Victorian high society, and it was expected at that time. He was also, by the way, the person who was in charge of the British Post. He was involved in the penny post, which made it accessible for commoners to send letters. And he was commercialized in 1843. Cole basically was in British high society, and it wasn't acceptable at the time to not respond to letters. But he was so busy, his letters were piling up. And so he went to Horsley and he said, hey, can you draw me a card I can send my acquaintances? And Horsley said, sure. He drew up, I don't know, a couple hundred of these things. I don't remember exactly how many. And Cole sent them out, and they were a hit. People loved them. There was some controversy over them. This is a copy of the first Christmas card. There was some controversy because on the cover, you can see that there is a child getting a drink of wine. So there clearly was some things wrong with Cole's original Christmas cards. But he was the originator of the Christmas cards. And they kind of took off from there. They've become a staple of American culture. Calvin Coolidge was the first president to deliver a Christmas message back in 1927. And then it kind of progressed from there. FDR was the first to give out Christmas cards to White House staff. And then Dwight D. Eisenhower was the first to send out an official White House Christmas card in 1953. And then Hallmark Cards, which was then founded as the Hall Brothers, which really got the Christmas card movement in America started, was founded in 1915. So Christmas cards are a kind of a Johnny-come-lately to the party. Clearly don't have anything pagan to do with them, although the origins were... The first Christmas card that we know of was very Christian, but the first commercialized Christmas card was, well, less Christian. So, you know, there is... There's that piece of information for you. What you do with it is entirely up to you. Again, did not originally contain religious images, merely a festive holiday theme. Right? They did not all contain nativities or anything like that. What about holly and or mistletoe? So far, really, we haven't had anything that was pagan. Well, this stuff is. Holly's association was used by Druids to quote-unquote ward off spirits. It was used basically to frighten the demons, according to the Druids. All right, and holly also was burned with ivy in the Celtic festival of Beltane for fertility rites in the spring. So if you wanted to call anything about Christmas pagan, this would be it. Holly and mistletoe would be it, because mistletoe's no better. Mistletoe is strongly associated with fertility in Norse mythology. It was associated with a fertility god. It was used to help women get pregnant and so on, right? And there's reasons for that I won't get into. But this stuff you could make the case that this is pagan, but again, God created this stuff to be used. Now, how it was used and how it got into Christmas was association with paganism, association with the Druidic religions of the Celts. So this stuff, yes, I have no problem if you want to remove all mistletoe and holly from your homes, because it actually is pagan. There, you can make a strong case that this is historically associated with paganism. And it was adopted, as I mentioned, by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages to bring in a lot of the pagans. What about stars? We see stars associated with Christmas a lot. Well, obviously, this originates with Matthew 2:2 and then Matthew 2:9 and 10, where it talks about the wise men seeing his star, right? Wise men seeing his star. Well, there's a couple of questions we need to ask about that star. Was it a natural phenomenon? And there are a couple of different options for natural phenomenon, things like a comet, a conjunction of Jupiter and Regulus, or a supernova. All those are options. Or was it a supernatural manifestation of God? That's what we need to ask the question, and I'm going to let Dr. Jason Weil, an astrophysicist, answer that question for us. So let's hear what Dr. Weil has to say.
So I think we've exhausted all natural phenomena, at least that I know about. There is no natural phenomena that can remain suspended over a particular location on Earth that's not the North Pole or the equator for any period of time, let alone 2 years. It had to be close to 2 years, right, that this thing lasted. And so my hypothesis is that the Christmas star was a supernatural manifestation of God's power. It was something that God created supernaturally. It rose from Bethlehem and then stood over there. The Magi from the Persia area would have seen it, and they would have traveled toward it. And the nice thing about this explanation, and again, I'm going beyond the text, and so you should feel free to reject that if you think that there's a better explanation. But the nice thing about this is it simultaneously resolves 5 difficulties in the text. There are 5 things in the text that are sort of hard to explain, but if you believe the star is a supernatural manifestation of God's power that was created over Christ at his birth and then rose from there and led the Magi and just hovered there, not particularly bright, that resolves all 5 of these difficulties. The first one is, why did the wise men go west if the star was in the east? And I'm suggesting to you they saw the star at its rising, which for natural objects is in the east. But this star rose in the west, okay? Because from Persia, you look west, you see Israel, and the star rises from Israel, okay? And so that explains why they went west. It explains why they recognized it as his star. The Magi were experts in astronomy, and they knew that all natural objects rise in the east, set in the west. And they see this one star rising in the west. They knew that could not be accounted for by any natural phenomenon. They knew that in their entire lives of having studied the heavens, nothing does that. Nothing rises in the west. Today you can see that because we have artificial satellites that do that. Okay, but before 1957, nothing did that. Before Sputnik, there was nothing that would rise in the west and set in the east. So this thing rises and then it hovers there, okay, just suspended there in space, and they would recognize that as supernatural at least. It explains why only the Magi noticed it, because those folks who are not all that familiar with the night sky would not recognize a star that's not particularly bright, that doesn't belong in that constellation. The Magi would have been familiar with the constellations, and they would have known there's an extra star in that one, and it rose in the west, unlike any natural star. It also explains Balaam's prophecy in Numbers 24:17, which says a star will rise from Israel, right? A scepter will rise from Israel, a star will come forth from Jacob. This star literally rose from Israel, okay? And so you can imagine that, and then it stood over where the child was, and no natural object would do that, but a supernatural creation of God would. So you can imagine the Magi who are looking for signs of the Messiah, okay, and then they see, on one night, they see a star rise over Israel, and they're reminded of Numbers 24:17. Oh, that's got to be the Messiah. All natural stars are setting in that direction. There's one star that's rising. It's got to be supernatural. It fulfills Numbers 24:17 because it's rising over Israel, and they would have recognized that has to be the Messiah's star. Has to be. There's no other explanation for it.
All right, so that was a bit of a long clip, but Dr. Weil, I think, made the very strong case that this was a supernatural manifestation of God's power, not anything else. I don't think it could possibly have been a natural object. Dr. Weil has a whole presentation on this on the Biblical Science Institute YouTube channel. It's entitled His Star, and I think you wouldn't have any trouble finding it if you were to go there. I'd recommend you watch it. It's about an hour long. It's well worth the hour if you're into anything at all about biblical history. All right, so that leaves us with the poinsettia. So let's move to the poinsettia. So what do we know about the poinsettia? Well, it originated in Central America. It was well known for its beauty. It was well known for being used quite a lot for decoration by the cultures in the area. There's quite a few things about the poinsettia. It was tied to Christmas, though, comes from Catholicism and a miracle myth. Basically, the idea was that there's this little girl, her name was Pepita, who was going to see a nativity play, and she wanted to bring a gift to the Christ child. And she didn't have anything. She was very poor. Kind of like a lot of these miracle stories start. And she basically decided, well, with some help, that she was going to gather up a bouquet of wildflowers from the roadside, and she was going to lay those before the Christ child, because that was all she could do. And so she did, and lo and behold, they miraculously turned into poinsettias. And they have been used by Catholics in Mexico ever since. And I don't believe a word of that. That's pure nonsense. That is absolutely pure nonsense. There is absolutely no reason that God would do that. None. That's completely adding to the text of Scripture. There's no verification for that whatsoever. Pure and utter rubbish. But that explains their tying into Christmas. Now, they came to America in 1828 via a man by the name of Joel Poinsett, hence the name Poinsettia, who was the first ambassador to Mexico from the United States. He was also an avid gardener. He had a hothouse on his farm, and so he had these sent back to his hothouse, and he started growing poinsettias. They didn't really popularize, though, until the early 1920s, when someone figured out how you could breed them indoors rather than in a garden or in a hothouse, and started selling them in association with Christmas, and they have been a major part of Christmas ever since. All right? Now, this is the one that a lot of people object to, the Christ Mass. That somehow Christmas is actually from Catholic tradition. That somehow Christmas is a Christ Mass, that the Catholics invented it. Well, let's look at that. Is Christmas derived from the Catholic Mass? Well, the word Mass that's attached to Christmas is from the Latin missa. All right, the Latin missa. Missa means sent out on a mission. That's what it meant in Christian circles. Right? So, realistically, if you read Christmas, what you should read it as is Christ sent out on mission. Christ sent out on mission. Well, what mission would that be? The mission to come to earth and redeem humanity. It's got nothing to do with Catholic tradition. Oh, and also, as an aside, if you tried to do this, make this argument in Italian, people would laugh at you. And the reason being is the word for Christmas in Italian is Natale. The word for Christmas in Spanish is Navidad. Doesn't work in those languages, does it? Doesn't sound anything like, Mass. The word Mass isn't involved at all. It's all about birth. Navidad. Navi, birth. Natale, birth. All right, we're talking about a birthday. So this is the name Christmas is just unfortunate in its looking like it attaches to the Catholic Mass. It doesn't actually attach to the Catholic Mass in any way, shape, or form. It has nothing whatsoever to do with Catholicism at all. And as we've seen, it was celebrated on December 25th before the Catholic Church really came into existence. So, what do we know? Well, we know Christmas is not based on pagan holidays. The date is not derived from paganism. We know that the Christmas tree has no pagan roots, pun intended as well as factual. We know that Santa Claus is based on a Christian, but has been paganized since then, has been highly commercialized into this jolly old elf that gives gifts to children and, grants all these greedy wishes in our Western world. Candy canes. We know that they didn't start out as Christian, but they've gained a lot of Christian significance. We know that snowmen were potentially originally anti-Semitic, but clearly do not mean that anymore. Right? They've completely lost that. We know that Christmas cards were first used to celebrate Christ, but were popularized as secular and have remained somewhat secular at least. We know that holly and mistletoe do derive from pagan practices. Their use in Christmas does. Right? We know that the Christmas star itself was miraculous. Right? And we know that Christmas is not of Catholic origin. Of course, now we also know that poinsettias are of Catholic origin. But Christmas itself is not. Right? So I already know that there are going to be people in the comments who are making comments saying, well, I still think Christmas is pagan. Well, that's fine. Do your own research. Do the research. Double check my quotes. Double check my sources. I listed most of them. Go into the history and find out for yourself. Look up Hippolytus of Rome's comments on Christmas. Look up Julius Africanus' comments on Christmas. Look them up. They're available. Find them. And don't just believe what you're told in Reader's Digest. Now, if you can find me historical quotes from before 202, AD 202, that say, don't celebrate this Christmas thing that's going around. It's pagan. It's being a pagan idea being brought into the church. Bring it. I'd love to see it. Because I want truth. I want facts. And if you can give me those facts, fantastic. I'll tear up this presentation. But until I see those facts, I'm going with the facts I have. Christmas is not based on pagan traditions. Certainly it has become paganized and commercialized, but it's not based on pagan tradition. And I'm going to end with this verse. Let no man therefore judge you in meat, or in drink, or in respect of an holy day, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. Folks, let's let that be our motto. Let's not judge someone if they keep or don't keep a holiday. You know what? I don't think that the Messianic Jews have to keep all those holidays that they keep. But you know what? They do anyway. And that's fine. They can believe that if they want to. I don't think that it's a sin to celebrate Christmas. I don't think it's a sin if you don't. We're not told one way or the other. If you want to celebrate Christmas, celebrate Christmas. If you don't want to celebrate Christmas, don't celebrate Christmas. It's entirely up to you. But don't tell me that I'm celebrating a pagan holiday because you don't have a single leg to stand on and that makes you sound ignorant. I'm sorry, but it does. If you can find historical evidence that Christmas traditions are pagan, then by all means present them. But I've dealt with everything I could think of that is associated with Christmas, and I've researched them all. The only one that I found that had pagan origins when you get into the history was holly and mistletoe. Everything else either was of Catholic origin in one instance, or was of purely secular origin, just a fun custom, or was actually Christian. So don't tell me I'm celebrating a pagan holiday. Christmas is not pagan. I'm not celebrating a pagan holiday. I'm not bowing down to trees. I'm not worshiping Sol Invictus. I'm remembering the birth of the Savior. And that is reason to celebrate. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed. This has been Emory Moynagh for In His Image. Check us out on inhisimage.blog. And I will see you in the next presentation. I hope every one of you, even those who don't celebrate, have a very, very Merry Christmas.